Thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Steph. I am on the LitFest board, and I'm the manager over at the bookstore. We're so pleased to have Keith Brein with us. He's the author of Paradise Falls, The True Story of an Environmental Collapse. He will be joined in conversation by our friend and yours, the Reverend Heidi Carrington Heath. Heidi Carrington Heath. Did you hear what I did? Yep, I switched it. Okay. All right. Keith Brein is a New York Times bestselling author and award-winning journalist. The New York Times Book Review has hailed him for his keen reportorial eye and lyrical writing style. He's written 3 books. He's been a finalist for the PEN ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing and has contributed to National Public Radio for more than a decade. Paradise Falls received numerous starred reviews and was longlisted for the 2023 Carnegie Medal. It was one of Water Street Bookstore's best-selling books of 2022 and one of my favorite books of the year. Just a really incredible read. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. The Reverend Heidi Carrington Heath is a resident of Exeter, which she lovingly calls Stars Hollow, don't we all? She's an amateur writer, and she's never without a pile of books on her nightstand. In her professional life, she's a chaplain and specialized minister who hears and holds a lot of stories. Heidi's married to the local author, the Reverend Dr. E. Carrington Heath. They share their home with 2 very precocious cats named Moxie and Windsor, who like to chew on books more than read them. And her favorite read of 2022 is Paradise Falls by Keith Brein. So we're going to start with a conversation between Keith and Heidi, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. As ever, please silence your cell phones, and books will be available after, and Keith will be happy to sign. So please join me in welcoming Heidi and Keith to Exeter LitFest.
Keith, thanks for being here today. I'm really glad to have you and excited to have this conversation. As someone from Western New York, where Paradise Falls takes place, Paradise Falls was hands down my favorite read of 2022. And when I thought about this conversation, one of the things that I really wondered about is why this story? What led you to tell the story of Love Canal and the folks who lived in that area?
Well, thank you so much for having me today, Heidi. Thank you, Steph, and thanks to Exeter LitFest. And thank you all for coming out. I know you have choices with what you do with your time. Time is our greatest commodity, in my opinion, so really thank you for being here. So with that in mind, time is my greatest commodity, too. How I use my time, what I research, that's everything. So, the book I wrote before Paradise Falls was called Fly Girls, and it's a totally different story, also narrative, nonfiction history. But it was a story of female pilots in the 1920s and 30s fighting for the right to fly and race planes. It was essentially a story of Amelia Earhart and her friends. And one of the things that I really sort of mourned, actually, during the research for that book was that several of those women had lived deep into the 1970s, were actually still alive when I was alive, and nobody went and found them. Nobody went and did an interview with them before they died. Nobody did an oral history. And it just sort of blew my mind, And so when I came out of that project, I was looking around and I was thinking about that a lot. And I began to think about, well, who are the people around us now who maybe did something important or significant once long ago, but might still be alive? And so, with that, I did start really looking at the 1970s, and I regret to inform all of you that the 1970s is now history. I was born in the early 1970s, and so I did have little snapshot memories of the decade, the kind of snapshot memories we all have from our early childhood. I remembered the gas lines. I remembered the hostage crisis. I remembered Carter on TV during that time, and I did remember this sort of mysterious place called Love Canal. But like a lot of people, I didn't really know what it was, where it was, what happened there. And so, I just started to go down that rabbit hole. And, I don't want to be too glib about what I do or about what any author does. We go down a lot of rabbit holes, and we poke around, and we check it out, and we see if there's enough there. Is there a story there? And, so I did that with a number of different topics, and then, did it with this story too, with the story of Love Canal. And once I started going down the rabbit hole and making some phone calls to people who were still alive and doing some phone interviews, and then going to the New York State Archives, which was my first archival visit, I realized that there was a huge story here that had never really been told, at least not the right way, in my opinion, and that's when I decided to delve into it.
So people look at me sort of funny when I say this story about an environmental catastrophe was my favorite read of 2022. But it was wildly compelling writing for me. And really at its core, what struck me about the story of Love Canal is it's a story of ordinary people who kind of rise up in the face of government entities and power who are ignoring them or not responding to their needs. And really, it's stories of women and moms. When I think of this book, I think of Lois and Luella and the stories of their families. And I wonder, what is one thing you hope we take away from Paradise Falls if we read it?
So I'll answer that. Maybe I'll give a little bit more context for folks who maybe also, like me a few years ago, didn't really know what Love Canal was. This was a working class neighborhood of starter homes about 6 miles due east of the waterfalls in Niagara Falls. These were primarily, young families with children who were, bought these single-story homes. They were all ranches, every single one of them, and they were really using this as a foothold to the middle class. And so, this was like a desirable place to live, for those kind of families. There was a school right in the middle of the neighborhood that had been built brand new in the 1950s. There was a big playground around it that had been strangely left undeveloped. And a lot of people moved there because their kids could walk to that school, and they could walk to that playground or ride their bikes or, roller skate over there in the way kids did, in the 60s and 70s. So, with that in mind, there were secrets, however, in the neighborhood. That school and that playground had once been an abandoned canal in the early part of the 20th century. That canal had been engineered by a man named William T. Love, the Love Canal. And it was actually a really genius engineering idea. If you picture where Niagara Falls is between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, they wanted to carve a cut-through, essentially, so that boat traffic, cargo traffic could skirt the falls, go around it. And you needed about 11 miles to do it. But of course, when he tried to do it, it was the 1890s. It was steam shovels, and it was incredibly difficult. And he gets about 1.5 miles, and the money dries up, the will dries up, and it's done. And this canal, this ragged channel going nowhere, sits there for a few decades. And then in the 1940s, a company named Hooker Chemical, one of the largest employers in town, the largest industrial taxpayer in Niagara Falls, acquires that land and begins using it as a dump for its chemical wastes and residues. And when I say using it as a dump, what they were doing is they were driving trucks out there, out of town. This was still an undeveloped part of Niagara Falls in the 40s and 50s. And dumping helter-skelter 55-gallon drums of chemical waste right into the old canal and then covering it up. And it was, it was as bad as it sounds. But in the 1950s, the city acquires it. They're told the land is safe. Hooker Chemical sells it to the city for $1. And they build that school there. And so that's sort of the backdrop for this story. And what I wanted to do early on was capture what was good about this neighborhood before all the problems happened. I wanted to let the secrets seep to the surface in the ways it did for the ordinary folks who lived there. And I was really drawn to these ordinary families who thought they were living in a good place and then realized that they weren't. And primarily there were two women that you mentioned, Heidi, who were really critical to this story. One was named Luella Kenny, and the other was Lois Gibbs. Luella Kenny was a working mom of 3 boys who lived just on the northern edge of the old canal and what was now the playground and school. And then there was Lois Gibbs, who lived 2 blocks to the east of the old playground and school. Lois was a stay-at-home mom, or as they said in the 1970s, Lois was a housewife. She had 2 children. Her husband worked at the Goodyear factory, over the chemical vats that a lot of men primarily worked over in Niagara Falls in the 1960s and 70s. And, Lois Gibbs and Luella Kenny are crucial to this story. They do what parents do, but in particular, I think what mothers do, which is, they connect problems in the outside world to problems in their own house. And recognize that these little stories that start to get written in 1977 and 1978 about this old chemical dump might actually be connected to problems that their kids are having. And they become, radicalized as a result, and really, refuse to accept the sort of company line in Niagara Falls, which is the land is safe, the ground is safe, the school is safe, you'll be fine. And I think one story that was really powerful to me was about Lois. Lois barely graduates from high school in the late 1960s, and she was really self-conscious about that. She was the kind of woman who would go to the PTA meeting but never talk. Go to the teacher conference but just nod and smile. She didn't feel confident to speak in public. And when the problems begin to emerge in the neighborhood, she does connect it to a problem that her son is having. And she goes to the school district in the spring of 1978, and she makes a modest request. She asks the school district to move her son, Michael, who's in kindergarten, to a different public school about 4 blocks away for the fall of that year, so that he could maybe avoid some of the health problems he was having. And I often wonder how history would be different if the school district had satisfied that request, but they don't. They tell Lois that her son is fine and the school is safe. And Lois is now angry and begins to go out into the neighborhood collecting signatures on a petition. And her petition at that point was, again, relatively modest. She just asked that they shut down the school until they could learn more about the chemicals beneath it. And she gathers about 161 signatures on this petition, and in August of 1978 brings it to Albany, New York, to the Capitol, where there's going to be a meeting about this Love Canal issue. And that day, she's stunned to learn that not only are they going to shut down the school, they're going to evacuate 200 families living closest to it. But not Lois's house. Lois's house is just outside that first evacuation zone. And she will begin, at that point, a 2-year fight to ultimately escape her own house.
I'm glad I was interested when I asked you that question, because Lois's story has really stayed with me too. And I've thought a lot about Lois and a lot about some of the other families in your book as we have watched real-time environmental disaster begin to dominate the news again in recent days. We have trains derailing in Ohio and West Virginia, pouring toxic chemicals into the air and into the water, and people being told, it's safe, you're fine, you're okay, and meanwhile all data points to all is not well. And so I wonder, what for you can this story teach us? What can we take from the story of Love Canal into our communities and into our world today?
So there are a couple positive things and, of course, some negative things. I I guess let's start with the negative first. So you're referencing the train derailments, specifically the one in East Palestine, Ohio. This is Love Canal all over again in so many ways. It is often impossible, legally or scientifically or medically, to connect, health problems, human health problems, to the chemicals in our air, in our water, in the soil. Is someone suffering from seizures because they're suffering from seizures, or is it because of the chemicals in the air? Is someone suffering from eczema and rashes because they're suffering from eczema and rashes, or is it because of some kind of chemical? It is almost impossible to prove in court, and corporate lawyers are really good at poking holes in all of these arguments, again, in a court of law. And the case in East Palestine, Ohio, is that writ large all over again. You've got clear and obvious chemical contamination. You've got an immediate distrust of authorities and governmental response. You've got people complaining of health problems that may or may not be connected to the chemicals. Who knows for sure? But when it's happening to you, as it did for the families in my story, you absolutely do believe it is because of the chemicals in your water or your soil or your air. So on the one hand, it's horrific to see this story play out all over again. I think just this week, the federal government sued Norfolk Southern, the railway line, in the same way that the government sued Hooker Chemical back in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, this is going to be litigated probably for several more years, maybe longer. There are still pending legal cases today in the case of Love Canal. So that's the bad news. The good news is, and this is why I think this story is so powerful, is that the women in particular, the ordinary mothers who pushed this story into the spotlight in the 1970s, really did, in a lot of ways, change the world, change America, change how we thought about the environment, change how we thought about our own backyard. A lot of people here will, of course, know the book Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson. That is really sort of a touchstone moment in not only American and environmental history, but really literary history. That book really did change how we thought about the environment. And that came out in the early 1960s. But it really was still in the 1970s when this story comes up. It really was still believed that this whole environmental thing was a West Coast hippie thing or an East Coast liberal thing. For a working class neighborhood like this in Niagara Falls, they didn't think much about their environment. And so when these working class mothers like Lois Gibbs and Luella Kenny, began to go on television, began to speak out, it did actually have a direct impact on how other working class folks thought about their backyards, thought about their homes, thought about their water. That was a real significant change. So it is in some ways the birth of citizen environmental activism. And they did really change federal policy. Love Canal is the first Superfund site. We hear that word and we know what that means, but it actually doesn't appear anywhere in congressional documents, official documents. When this problem emerged in Niagara Falls in '78 and into '79, there was a discussion that the government needed some kind of fund of money that could be utilized to clean up a site when it was a sort of orphaned land. Hooker had sold it to the city. They blamed the city for the problems. The city blamed Hooker. Who was to blame, for what had happened there? And so the government realized that it needed, money to come in and clean it up while you're waiting for litigation, which again could last for a decade. And so they began to discuss in Washington that they needed this large fund of money, a super fund of money, which initially was $1.6 billion. And there's two fascinating little side stories about it. The first is, a young congressman comes to Niagara Falls in the days before the first hearing on this issue to see these sites in town for himself. He wants to visit the Love Canal land, but Hooker had actually dumped chemicals in 3 other sites in Niagara Falls. And so he wants to visit the land before Lois Gibbs and another woman come down to testify before his committee. And so Lois is busy with her 2 kids, busy trying to juggle, her family life, and now her activism, and what is now effectively a job for her. And so she lets another local activist borrow her Oldsmobile Cutlass to go pick up this congressman at the airport. She doesn't even meet him herself, because he seemed pretty small time. That congressman was Al Gore. And, Al Gore, really does begin to push this rock up the hill in these early congressional hearings in March of 1979. Lois Gibbs testifies before Al Gore and his committee, but Al Gore had only been in Congress for about 2 years. And then what's also fascinating to me is that even though these hearings begin in March of 1979, when people are still trapped in this neighborhood, it will take another 20 months before the Superfund legislation is passed. And what is really so interesting is that this legislation, which was sweeping new taxes to corporations, that's how the Superfund legislation was funded, from taxes to oil, gas, and chemical companies. This legislation gets passed in December 1980. Now, why is that interesting? To me, it's interesting because, of course, Jimmy Carter has lost, and he has lost badly in November of that year. He is a lame duck president, and this is a lame duck Congress. And everybody in that Congress knew that the president-elect, Ronald Reagan, would not approve of the Superfund legislation, would not have signed it. And still, in December of that year, this sweeping legislation is passed by Congress, both houses, working in a bipartisan manner to take decisive action. It is really hard to imagine that happening today, sadly.
I could talk to you all afternoon just about this book. Friends, if we haven't convinced you already, please think about buying a copy of this book on your way out today, or grab it at the library. I can't recommend it enough to you. But I wonder if I can ask you a little bit about a couple of your other projects and your writing process. And I was really struck looking sort of at all 3 books that you put out, and I've read 2 of the 3. I've read Fly Girls and Paradise Falls, and I haven't read Outside Shot yet. And there's a little bit of a common thread among them of underdogs or untold stories. And so I wondered, how do you choose your projects that you write about? Is there a magic factor or an it factor that draws you to a particular story?
Yeah, so I really don't, even when I was a staff writer at the Boston Globe, I was a general assignment reporter on the Metro desk. I didn't want to be hemmed into just writing about one topic, and I still don't now. Might I write another book with an environmental theme? Yes, I might. Might I write another book about aviation? Yes, but I don't want to feel like I have to do that. And so I am looking for a few things when I'm looking for stories. I'm looking for an interesting world. I'm looking for people you can root for and root against, and then there has to be some kind of arc. There has to be some kind of journey that they go on. Those are sort of fundamental elements of the classic story formula, if you think about it, right? Like, if you think about the movies you love, or the shows you love, or the books you love, it often has, those 3 elements. And the reason why I'm looking for those is not just because it is sort of a classic formula, but it's because it's a human story then. And that, I think, is one of the crucial elements of all of my books is to sort of find the humanity there and shine a spotlight on that. Another way I think about my books is, I'm still figuring out how to live in this world, and when I tackle a certain subject, I'm selfishly sort of learning how to live, through the people I'm writing about, and so that's, I think, another element that's really important to me. But the book that I'm working on right now, which will be out probably in about a year, is also sort of an underdog story, but it in other ways less so. That book that I'm writing is about the rise and the fall of Pete Rose, the baseball player. And to me, obviously, Pete Rose is totally different than the mothers in Paradise Falls or the forgotten aviators in Fly Girls. But to me, he is such a human character. He's like a miracle and a disaster, all wrapped up in one. He never should have gotten as far as he did. And he never should have fallen as far as he did, and how that happened is, to me, just a fascinating tale of human choices and the cost of those choices. And so, not necessarily an underdog story, but I hope anyway, also a very human story.
If there is a summary of the human experience, it's we are a miracle and a disaster, all in one, every one of us, I think. I wonder what advice you have for new or aspiring writers. If you could give one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh my gosh. Drink lots of coffee. Coffee in the morning, wine at night? I don't know. I'm going to say something here that's sort of trite and often gets said. It's a lonely business. It's a lonely world. Living in the page. Living in the archive, and any author you see at this event this weekend or any other event like this will tell you that you're just consumed with doubt at all times. Constantly consumed with the, am I going to be able to finish this? Am I going to be able to do this? Even though, of course, I've done it now a few times, every time I start to tackle it, you do wonder, how am I ever going to finish this? Or how am I going to finish this by the deadline? And so, for me, just pushing down that doubt is crucial. Letting go of rejection is crucial. And there are ways to do that beyond coffee and wine. I need to know when I start a project, I need to know what the end is. I often have in my mind, or even on the page, what my last line of the whole book is. And that doesn't happen right away. But I never feel like I really know what path I'm on until I know that last line, or that last scene, or that last moment. And then once I do, it's almost like it just then becomes a marathon, if you will, where you're only on mile 1, but the finish line is out there. I know that one of these days, 9 months from now, 12 months from now, whatever it is, I'm going to get to write that paragraph around that moment. On Paradise Falls, again, a lot of those protagonists and antagonists were still alive, and I got to spend time with them. And I won't ruin the end of the book for you, but the end of the book happened in real time today. And And, I won't reveal anything more to say that I was with one of the characters, and we were out in the world doing something, and things were happening, and I realized, this is the end. And I'm just recording. And the recorder is running, and the recorder is running, and the recorder is running. On Fly Girls, again, all of those women were dead, but one of those women had a daughter who was still alive. And, I spent time in her house, and I spent time in her little family archives, the things that people keep in their closets and their attics, which, by the way, I love people who keep things in their closets and their attics. And she had kept things that had not been given to any museum because they didn't seem relevant, because it was a letter between a mother and a daughter, or a letter between her parents back when they were courting, And I was reading one of those letters on the floor of this woman's guest bedroom, and there was this paragraph, and I'm like, this is the end. And so when I find that, then I know sort of what my guiding light is. I know how to get from A to B. I don't know all the twists in the road that are going to come on that path, because there will be twists in the road, but I know that I will ultimately get there.
Will you tell us what you're reading right now?
I will. So I read a lot of nonfiction, primarily, but I do mix in fiction as well. The book that I'm reading right now is The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland. I got it at Exeter, at Water Street Books right here in Exeter about a month ago. It's a story of a man who escaped from Auschwitz. That's what I'm reading right now. But I don't know, I hate to admit this, I often have like 3 books going at once. I'm one of those people. So I'm also reading Fleischman is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner, is another book that I sort of have in the air right now. And I sort of decide which one I want to read based on how I feel.
I feel redeemed as someone who also regularly has 2 or 3 books going at the same time. So
I can't help it. I can't help it.
I know. I wonder, as you read and explore other stories, and as you listen for what pulls you in the world, is there a story you'd really love to tell or love to write about, but you haven't yet?
Oh my gosh. So there are so many stories that I want to tell. I have this constant list of story ideas, sometimes pinned to my wall in my home office, sometimes in scraps of paper and in notebooks. Almost too many to mention. And if I really loved the story idea, I would definitely not mention it, because I don't want anybody to steal it, which is, I don't know if it's something only I feel as an author, but I definitely feel that, oh my gosh, I hope somebody doesn't write this book. Because, again, it takes a couple of years to get one of these things out, and so, that's time lost while you're working on one thing and you don't know what somebody else is doing. I will say, I often go to archives if it's close by, just to see what's there. And I did spend a day this week in Albany, New York, at the State Archives in Albany, going through a letter collection. After going through it, probably won't be a book, but I don't know, it's sort of interesting, and maybe it'll be something else.
Can I ask you a couple of personal questions, and then we'll take some questions from our friends?
Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm on my therapist's couch.
In your bio, one of the things Steph did not read is that you claim parallel parking as your superpower. Is there anything you'd like to share about that?
Well, I'll share this. I'm happy to park anyone's car for the rest of this weekend out here on the street. I charge just a marginal fee. I think everybody, a lot of people like to think they're a great parallel parker. I went to school in Chicago, college in Chicago, and I really wanted to bring my car after one semester at school, and I didn't have money to pay for parking, so I was one of those people who had to move the car constantly, to get the spot based on snow plowing and street cleaning, and so I got pretty good at parallel parking in college as a necessity, but famously, I did live in New Orleans for about a decade. And during festival season, which is sort of is in New Orleans from like Mardi Gras to Jazz Fest, parking is pretty difficult. And a famous story in my family was that we were in the car. It was me, it was my wife, it was both of our kids, and it was my wife's father, my father-in-law. So we're a packed car, and we're downtown. It was festival season. We're trying to get a spot. And it was this tiny, tiny little spot. And I had a Prius at the time, and I just three-point parked that thing, boom, boom, and there were people on the street, and we get out of the car, and this guy was standing there, and he looked at me with awe, and he said, "I have watched 8 people try to park there. You're the only one who did it." And it's like famous in our family now. And it's gonna go on my tombstone.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I'm going to ask you a few rapid-fire questions, and these are just first thing that comes to your mind. Don't overthink it. What's your favorite novel?
I loved News of the World by Paula Giles.
Yay. Favorite NCAA women's basketball team?
Oh, Caitlin Clark and Iowa, done.
What's in your podcast feed right now?
I have Serial in my podcast. I have Radio Lab. I have, what else? This American Life.
Very good. Friends, I wonder if you might have questions for Keith or things you'd like to know more about. Okay. I'm going to play Vanna and make my way to you.
And I will sit alone up here on a stage, which is weird.
Sure.
Hi, Keith. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I haven't read your book, Paradise Falls, but I plan to. I'm going to buy it as soon as I leave here. But I wondered, I have a couple of questions. So one's about that book, and that is what you think the tipping point was when the government finally took those 2 mothers seriously. And then the other ones are about you and your writing. So I wondered, do you write every day, and are you self-published? And if you got a publishing deal, maybe you could talk about that experience.
So the tipping point in the narrative, I won't reveal in detail because it is sort of the climax of the book. But there is a moment where they realize that going to Congress, testifying, writing letters isn't enough. And they're going to have to actually risk something. They're going to have to risk potentially being arrested. They're going to have to risk going to jail. And without revealing any more, obviously they do decide to risk it. And to me, again, not to belabor it, but like that was what was so powerful to me, and what I identified early on was that they did decide to risk it. And at the risk of sounding preachy right now, as it gets to the bigger environmental problems that we are all facing, the secrets that are seeping to surface in all of our backyards right now. And I don't mean chemicals, I mean climate change, and I mean the consequences of that. I do feel like we all might have to risk something in order to get people's attention. That it was not only powerful to me as it relates to the narrative, but I think is instructive to me now. As for writing, Yes, I have a publisher, I have a publishing deal, I have been very fortunate in that regard. I don't write every day because, say for example, right now on my Pete Rose book, I'm waiting for edits. And so I just, I'm working on other things while I'm waiting for those, and slowly going insane as I wait for those. And so for me, because the writing I do is very specific to a nonfiction story, whether it's for a journalistic outfit or whether it's for a book, I'm working on that story. And so I go through periods where I'm just researching and reporting, and then I'm writing, and then I'm researching and reporting, and then I'm writing. And but when I do write, it does need to be every day. And I don't have a specific word count I want to get to, but I do keep track of those words every day, and I do measure my own self-worth based on how many words I was able to churn out. And as I will often say in the kitchen, at night when I'm done, to my wife or my kids, I'll say, well, or they'll ask me, because they know how to ask now, they'll say, how many good words did you write today? Because unfortunately, they aren't all good words.
Anybody else?
As a former newspaper man, could you speak about how communities, individuals can sound the alarm about issues when so many of our communities no longer have a local newspaper? And can social media, faithfully put those issues before the public in a believable, effective way?
Yeah, I mean, the slow death of local journalism is a real threat to public accountability across all fronts, whether it's something related to how a local government is behaving, criminal justice, and certainly environmental justice. It's a real threat. And I don't have a quick answer to that. I don't think anybody does. And and it is critical, in the reason why Lois Gibbs, Luella Kenny even knew that there were problems underneath that school is that in early 1978, one reporter at the Niagara Falls Gazette does begin to write about it and does take an interest and does start going out there. And unfortunately, that is at times, what it takes. For me, I still subscribe to a few newspapers. Even if I don't read them every day, even if they start to pile up, it's almost like, I'm doing a public service by trying to keep those media outfits in business because it is crucial.
That might be it.
Well, I just want to thank you all for coming. I think I'm going to be, am I signing right now, Steph? I'm going to be signing at the table back there. Happy to take any other questions back at the table. I know that Water Street has copies of both Fly Girls and Paradise Falls. Heidi, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to ask me all these questions. And I want to thank you all for coming out. It was a real pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much.